My name is Lydia Finch, and I'm 32 years old. For most of my life, my family has seen me as something of an equation that doesn't quite balance, a dissonant note in a melody they all knew by heart. In a family that worshipped at the altar of art, my love for the stark, clean beauty of mathematics made me a permanent outsider. I never imagined that the very numbers they scorned, the logic they found so cold and alien, would one day become the only thing standing between the Finch family and utter ruin. I never thought the sweetest revenge I could ever have wouldn't be an angry word or a dramatic exit, but the quiet, undeniable click of a lock that only I could open. Before I dive into this story of how an impossible puzzle left by a long-dead ancestor forced my family to finally see my worth, I'd love it if you let me know where in the world you're watching from in the comments below. It's always incredible to see how far these stories travel, and if you've ever felt like the odd one out in your own family, go ahead and hit that like button. For those of you who are new here, make sure you subscribe to join this amazing community of people who understand that sometimes the ones who are most overlooked are the ones holding all the keys. Our home, the one I grew up in, wasn't just a house, it was a curated gallery, a shrine to the arts. We didn't live in rooms so much as we drifted through exhibits. The walls were heavy with oil paintings, mostly brooding landscapes and abstract portraits done by distant relatives or acquired by my father Robert in moments of passion. Sunlight struggled to get through the thick velvet curtains, as if the outside world's harsh, unfiltered reality was an unwelcome guest. The air itself seemed thick, permanently scented with lemon polish, old paper, and the faint rosinous tang of my cousin Julian's cello, which was his instrument of choice that year. My father was a man who spoke about color palettes and brushstrokes with the reverence a priest reserves for scripture. My mother Beatrice could find profound, life-altering meaning in a single line of poetry. It was a beautiful world, I suppose, but it had no room for the rigid, elegant certainty of a well-formed proof. My cousin Julian was the sun around which our family's solar system revolved. He was my Aunt Genevieve's son, and from the moment he could first hum a recognizable tune, he was hailed as a prodigy. He wasn't just a boy, he was the future of our family's artistic legacy. Every clumsy piano chord was a revelation, every screech of his violin a symphony in the making. He was all charm and flowing hair, with a flair for the dramatic that they mistook for genius. He absorbed their praise like a plant soaking up water, and it made him bloom into a person of immense yet fragile confidence. He wasn't a bad person, not really. He was simply a product of his environment, a living testament to the family's deeply held belief that creating art was the highest calling a human could aspire to. And then there was me. I was the strange, quiet moon, orbiting at a distance, reflecting a light they didn't recognize. While Julian was practicing scales, I was finding solace in the absolute truths of geometry. While he was being praised for a finger painting that was little more than a brown smear, I was discovering the infinite, breathtaking patterns in prime numbers. My world was one of logic, of structure, of finding the hidden order beneath the chaos of the universe. To me, a perfect equation was more beautiful than any painting, more moving than any sonata. It was a piece of universal truth you could hold in your mind. But when I tried to share this passion, their eyes would glaze over. My father would pat my head and say, "That's nice, dear," his attention already drifting back to the catalog for an upcoming art auction. My mother would offer a tight, confused smile. "I just don't understand how you can spend so much time with those cold, dry numbers," she'd say, as if I were confessing a morbid fascination with tax law. They didn't see the beauty or the passion, they only saw the absence of what they valued. I learned to keep my world to myself. My bedroom became my sanctuary, the walls covered not in posters of bands but in graph paper filled with my own explorations. I found a sense of belonging in the lives of mathematicians long dead, Sophie Germain, who had to pretend to be a man to study, Srinivasa Ramanujan, who saw equations in his dreams. They were my secret family, the only ones who seemed to understand the thrill of chasing an elusive, elegant truth. My parents saw my retreat as a sign of my oddness, my inability to connect. They couldn't comprehend that I was connecting, just not with them. I was connecting with the very structure of reality, a relationship far more stable and rewarding than the fickle, conditional love offered in our living room. The pattern of our lives was set early, cemented in 1,000 tiny moments that, when stacked together, formed the unbreachable wall between my world and theirs. One particular Saturday afternoon when I was 10 years old is seared into my memory with the clarity of a mathematical axiom. I had spent the entire week wrestling with a concept from a university-level number theory book I'd secretly checked out of the city library. It was about proving the infinitude of prime numbers. I hadn't just read the proof, I had, through painstaking effort, recreated my own version of it. It was, to my 10-year-old mind, the single greatest accomplishment of my life. My heart hammered with a pride so fierce it felt like it might crack my ribs. I ran downstairs, my notebook clutched in my hand, the pages filled with the neat, triumphant march of my logical steps. I found my father in his study, surrounded by stacks of art history books. The room smelled of leather and pipe smoke. "Dad, look," I burst out, my voice trembling with excitement. "I did it, I wrote a proof. It shows that there will always be another prime number, no matter how high you count." I laid the notebook on his large mahogany desk, my finger tracing the final victorious line. QED. He picked it up, his brow furrowed in concentration, and for a glorious fleeting second, I thought he saw it. I thought he understood. He looked at the page for a long moment, then slowly looked up at me, his expression unreadable. Then he smiled, a distant paternal smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Very clever, Lydia. A lot of symbols." He patted my head, the gesture I had come to dread, the universal symbol of his affectionate dismissal. "Now, run along and get ready. We have to leave for Julian's recital in an hour, and you know your mother wants us there early to get good seats." My proof, my piece of infinity, was reduced to clever symbols. The elation drained out of me, replaced by a familiar, hollow ache. Later that evening, we sat in a stuffy community hall that smelled of floor wax and stale popcorn. Julian, who was 12, walked onto the stage. He looked angelic in a little tuxedo, his dark hair carefully combed. He sat at the grand piano, took a dramatic breath, and began to play. It was a simple piece by Bach, one I knew well, and he butchered it. He hit sour notes, his timing was off, and at one point he paused for a full 5 seconds, his face flushed with panic, before stumbling back into the melody. It was, by any objective measure, a poor performance. When he finally finished, my family leaped to their feet. My father, mother, and aunt led a thunderous standing ovation. Tears streamed down my mother's face. "The passion," she whispered breathlessly to my father. "Did you hear the soul in his playing?" At the small reception afterward, Julian was mobbed. He was a hero. Such emotional depth for one so young, a family friend cooed. Aunt Genevieve was radiant with pride. "He feels the music so deeply," she announced to anyone who would listen. "It isn't about hitting the right notes for Julian, it's about expressing the truth of his heart." They had invented a narrative of artistic struggle and soulful expression to cover for his simple incompetence. Meanwhile, I stood by the punch bowl, my notebook with its perfect, irrefutable proof still in my bag, feeling completely and utterly invisible. That night, I understood. In my family, a flawed, emotional performance would always be worth more than a cold, perfect truth. Julian's mistakes were celebrated as passion. My precision was dismissed as a lack of it. This dynamic didn't fade as we grew older. It intensified, calcifying into undeniable fact. The summer I turned 17 was the summer of the university letters. I had applied to one of the country's top universities, a place renowned for its rigorous mathematics program. My acceptance had been a long shot, but I had poured everything I had into my application, my essays, and the advanced exam they required. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, a thick, creamy envelope with the university's crest embossed in the corner. My hands shook so much I could barely tear it open. I read the words, and the world tilted on its axis. "We are pleased to offer you admission, along with the Chancellor's Scholarship for Excellence." A full ride. It was everything I had ever dreamed of, a validation of all my secret hours spent with my books, my equations, my secret family of long-dead geniuses. I waited until dinner to tell everyone, wanting to share the moment. I pictured their surprise, their pride. Maybe this, I thought, this undeniable achievement, would finally be enough. When I made my announcement, there was a moment of silence. My father cleared his throat. "Well," he said slowly, "that's excellent news, Lydia. Truly, a very prestigious institution." My mother smiled her tight smile. "A full scholarship? My, how practical. We won't have to worry about your tuition then. That's a relief." Aunt Genevieve offered a thin, "Congratulations, dear," and that was it. The conversation immediately shifted to the upcoming retrospective of some obscure painter my father admired. My monumental, life-changing news was treated as a logistical convenience. It was practical. It was a relief. It wasn't a cause for celebration. A week later, Julian's letter arrived. He had been accepted into a respectable but by no means elite music conservatory. That evening, our house was suddenly filled with flowers and the pop of a champagne cork. My parents and aunt were ecstatic. My father called everyone he knew, his voice booming with pride. My nephew, Julian, he's going to the conservatory. The boy is a true artist, destined for greatness. That weekend, they threw a massive party. The house was filled with their friends, all of them from the art world. Caterers served tiny, elegant canapés. A string quartet played softly in the corner, an actual professional string quartet. There were toasts. My father stood, champagne flute held high, and gave a long emotional speech about nurturing genius, about the Finch family's sacred duty to the arts, about Julian carrying the torch for a new generation. Julian, blushing and beaming, soaked it all in. Everyone applauded wildly. During the height of the celebration, my mother found me by the kitchen door. "Lydia, darling, would you be a dear and help the caterers pass around the shrimp puffs? They seem to be a bit overwhelmed." I spent the rest of my cousin's celebration party serving food, a ghost at the feast of my own quiet resentment. I even tried in my early 20s to bridge the gap through their own language. I had just started my first real job at a small tech firm, doing data analysis. It wasn't glamorous, but it was fascinating work, and I saw the potential to start my own consultancy. I put together a detailed business plan full of financial projections, market analysis, and risk assessments. It was a beautiful document in its own way, a logical, structured path to success. I needed a small loan for startup capital, and my father, with his extensive financial portfolio, was the obvious person to ask. I nervously presented the plan to him in his study one afternoon. He flipped through the pages, his expression growing more and more skeptical. The charts, the graphs, the numbers, they were a foreign language to him. "Lydia," he said, closing the binder with a soft thud, "this is very thorough. But it's all just speculation, isn't it? These tech businesses, they come and go. It seems so impersonal, so bloodless. I can't in good conscience invest in something so risky, something with no real soul to it." He refused to co-sign the loan. 2 months later, I found out he had given Julian $50,000, not as a loan but as a gift. It was to fund the production of Julian's debut album, a collection of experimental cello compositions. Julian had no business plan, no distribution deal, no marketing strategy. He just had a vision. The album was a commercial catastrophe. They sold, by my calculation, fewer than 200 copies, most of them to forgiving family members. The $50,000 simply vanished, absorbed into the black hole of Julian's artistic ambition. When I gently brought this up with my father, pointing out the disparity, he became defensive. "That's entirely different, Lydia. Supporting the arts is never a waste. It's an investment in culture, in beauty. Julian's work enriches the world. Your spreadsheets do not." The message was clear. His actual tangible money was better spent on a failed art project than on my viable logical business. A beautiful failure was worth more than a boring success. After that, I stopped trying. I got the loan on my own, through a bank that thankfully cared a great deal more about my spreadsheets than it did about my soul. I built my small consultancy from the ground up, quietly and methodically, on my own terms. I kept a professional distance from my family, attending the obligatory holiday dinners but keeping my life, my work, and my triumphs entirely separate. It was easier that way. It hurt less. The call that shattered our carefully constructed world came on a rainy Tuesday in October. I was at my office, deep in a complex data model, when my mother's name flashed on my phone. She never called me during the workday. My stomach clenched. Her voice was thin and reedy, a sound I'd never heard from her before. "Lydia," she said, her voice cracking, "you need to come home, right now. Your father, something has happened." I broke every speed limit getting there. I imagined all sorts of terrible scenarios: a heart attack, a stroke, an accident. The reality was somehow both less tragic and more catastrophic. I found them in the grand living room, the one usually reserved for parties. My father was slumped in his favorite wingback chair, looking smaller and older than I had ever seen him. His face was a sickly ashen gray. My mother was pacing, her hands twisting a silk scarf into a knot. Aunt Genevieve was sitting bolt upright on the sofa, her face a mask of disbelief. Julian stood by the grand piano, one hand resting on the keys as if for support. The story came out in broken, panicked fragments. My father, in his quest to be a patron of the arts, had strayed from his traditionally conservative investment strategy. Over the past few years, he had become infatuated with a series of art tech startups, companies promising to revolutionize the art world with blockchain verification, virtual galleries, and AI-driven creation tools. He saw himself as a visionary, a Medici of the digital age. He poured almost everything into them, our family's entire fortune, a legacy built over generations, and one by one, like a row of dominoes, they had all collapsed. The market had turned, the technology was flawed, the promises were empty, it was all gone. Everything. The stocks were worthless, the house was mortgaged to the hilt, the accounts were empty, we were ruined. The news settled over the room like a shroud. The silence was absolute, broken only by my mother's ragged breaths. Then, the dam of denial broke. "How could you, Robert?" Genevieve shrieked, her voice sharp with betrayal. "How could you be so stupid?" My father flinched as if struck. I believed in their vision," he stammered, his voice weak. "It was about supporting innovation, the future of art. The future of art." My mother cried, her voice rising to a hysterical pitch. "We have no future, we have nothing." In the midst of this rising tide of panic and recrimination, Julian did the only thing he knew how to do. He sat down at the piano and began to play. A slow, mournful Chopin nocturne filled the room. He intended it, I'm sure, as a soothing balm, a way to express the profound sorrow of the moment through the universal language of music. The effect was precisely the opposite. It was like pouring gasoline on a fire. "For God's sake, Julian, stop that noise," Genevieve snapped, whirling on her son. "Can't you see this is serious? Your little tunes can't help us now." Julian's hands froze over the keys, his face a picture of wounded confusion. For the first time, his art wasn't just useless, it was an irritant. The son of our family had just been told to stop shining because his light was annoying. It was a small, brutal moment of irony in a day full of it. He was, at last, as helpless as they had always seen me. A few days later, we were gathered again in that same living room. This time, we were joined by Mr. Davies, our family's lawyer for as long as I could remember. He was a kind, stoic man with sad eyes, and he did not look happy to be there. The room was already starting to look different. Small, discreet stickers from an auction house had begun to appear on furniture and paintings. The process of dismantling our lives had begun. Mr. Davies laid a single, ancient-looking leather-bound folder on the coffee table. "After a thorough review of your father's assets and liabilities," he began, his voice gentle but firm, "the situation is as you feared. The debts are substantial. The sale of this house and its contents will cover most of them, but it will leave you with effectively nothing." He paused, letting the weight of that word settle. "However," he continued, tapping the folder, "there is one remaining asset, one thing the creditors cannot touch." He explained. "My great-grandfather, Alistair Finch, the man who had originally built the family's wealth, had been a brilliant but deeply eccentric man. He was a master horologist, a clockmaker, and a gifted amateur mathematician. He had seen the artistic inclinations of his children and grandchildren as a form of charming but dangerous frivolity. He feared they would squander his life's work on what he called ephemeral whims, so he had set up a significant portion of his fortune in a unique financial instrument, a multi-generational annuity. It was structured to be untouchable, accumulating value over decades, a failsafe against the very ruin my father had just brought upon us." Mr. Davies slid a document out of the folder. "The annuity is now worth, well, it's a life-altering amount of money," he said quietly, "enough to solve all your problems and secure your futures many times over." A wave of audible relief washed through the room. My mother closed her eyes and put a hand to her chest, but Mr. Davies wasn't finished. "There is, of course, a complication," he sighed. "Alistair, in his infinite and rather paranoid wisdom, locked the annuity. It can only be accessed by a single complex pictographic key. He believed that any descendant worthy of his fortune should possess not just his blood but a measure of his intellect. For nearly 80 years, no one has been able to solve it." He explained that the clues to the key were contained in 3 items Alistair had left behind, now stored in a safe deposit box which Mr. Davies had brought with him. He opened a small metal case on the table. Inside, nestled on a bed of velvet, were the 3 artifacts of our potential salvation. The first was a stunningly intricate pocket watch of Alistair's own design, its face a marvel of gears and dials. The second was a rolled-up celestial chart, a map of the night sky from a specific date and location, hand-drawn with meticulous precision. The third was a small stack of sheet music, bound in leather. Alistair was also a composer of sorts, Mr. Davies explained, though his music was said to be challenging, dissonant, mathematical. Julian's eyes lit up, a flicker of his old confidence returning. Music, he breathed, reaching for the sheets. It's a melodic key. Of course, it's not about cold logic, it's about the soul of the notes. My father and Aunt Genevieve seized on this idea with desperate optimism. A star chart, my father exclaimed, unrolling the map. He's pointing us to a constellation, a sign. It's a message of artistic inspiration. They saw what they wanted to see. They saw a puzzle that could only be solved by the very sensibilities they cherished. They looked at the watch, the stars, and the music, and they saw art. I looked at them, and all I could see was math. The days that followed were a surreal, tragic comedy of errors. They turned the living room into a command center for their hopeless quest. Julian sat at the piano for hours, playing the dissonant, jarring melodies from Alistair's sheet music. He tried playing them forwards, backwards, in different keys. He'd close his eyes in intense concentration, his head cocked as if listening for a secret message from the spirit world. "I can almost hear it," he'd mutter, sweat beading on his forehead. "The answer is in the emotional resonance of this chord progression." There was no emotional resonance. It was just a sequence of mathematically derived, tonally unrelated notes. It sounded like a cat walking on the keyboard. My father and Aunt Genevieve, meanwhile, were hunched over the star chart, which they had pinned to the wall. They treated it like a Rorschach test, finding patterns where none existed. "Look, Robert," Genevieve would say, tracing a line with her finger. "If you connect these stars, it almost looks like a painter's easel. He's telling us the key is the name of a famous painter." They spent an entire day trying passwords like Rembrandt and Da Vinci. I tried to intervene. I tried to explain the concepts of steganography, where information is hidden within other information. I tried to show them how the intricate gears of the watch worked on principles of modular arithmetic. I pointed out that the stars on the chart were not random, but corresponded to known celestial events that could be used as data points. They waved me away with condescending pats on the arm. "Lydia, darling, this is a family secret," my mother said gently, as if I weren't part of the family. "It's about our heritage, our intuition. It's not one of your computer problems." My father was more blunt. "This is about understanding the soul of an artist, which Alistair clearly was. With all due respect, your kind of thinking is too linear, too rigid." They didn't just ignore my expertise. They saw it as a handicap. My logical mind, in their view, made me incapable of the creative leap necessary to solve the puzzle. The irony was so thick I could barely breathe. While they were chasing artistic ghosts and melodic phantoms, I saw the truth of it. This wasn't a poem to be interpreted. It was a system to be decoded. Alistair Finch hadn't left behind a spiritual quest. He had left behind a final, brilliant, mathematical exam, and I was the only one in the family who had a chance in hell of passing it. While they wasted time on their flights of fancy, I began my work in secret. I took high-resolution photographs of the watch, the star chart, and every page of the musical score. I retreated to my small bedroom, the one place in the house that was mine, a sanctuary of order amidst their artistic chaos. The for sale sign had gone up on the lawn, a constant looming reminder that our time was running out. The pressure was immense, a physical weight on my chest. But as I dove into the problem, something else took over, a pure, exhilarating intellectual challenge. It was just me and Alistair, two minds reaching for each other across a century of misunderstanding. I printed out the pages and spread them across my floor. For the first few days, I just looked, letting the patterns seep into my subconscious. I saw it then. They weren't three separate clues. They were three interconnected parts of a single, elegant system. One afternoon, my mother came into my room without knocking, holding a black trash bag. She saw the papers covering my floor and sighed in exasperation. "Lydia, really, we're trying to pack, to keep things orderly for the viewings, and you're making this mess. What is all this doodling?" She bent down and started to gather up a corner of my printouts, the pages containing my initial notes on the gear ratios of the watch. "Let's just tidy this all up. It can't be important." A jolt of pure adrenaline shot through me. "Stop," I yelled, my voice sharper than I intended. "Don't touch that." She froze, genuinely shocked. I never raised my voice. "That's not doodling, Mother. That's my work." She looked from my face to the papers in her hand, her expression one of utter incomprehension. "Work? Lydia, this is just numbers and lines. Julian is downstairs, actually working on the problem. The casual, unthinking cruelty of that sentence almost took my breath away. She saw my meticulous analysis as a child's mess and Julian's useless theatrics as progress. She dropped the papers back on the floor with a little huff of offense and left, closing the door a little too loudly. She had almost thrown away our salvation because she thought she was tidying up. After that, I worked with my door locked. The first breakthrough came from the star chart. It was, as I suspected, not a picture but a dataset. It was dated April 12, 1888, from the location of Alister's observatory. Using astronomical software, I could cross-reference the positions of the stars he'd marked. They weren't constellations. They were specific, numbered stars from the Henry Draper catalog, and when I listed them out, their catalog numbers formed a sequence. I ran a dozen tests, and then I found it. They were all prime numbers, a specific, non-obvious sequence of large primes. That was the first layer, the foundation. The watch was the second layer. It was a masterpiece of mechanical engineering. It didn't just tell time, it tracked lunar phases, planetary positions, and the equation of time. It was a miniature brass and steel computer. After days of studying its mechanism from my photographs, I realized the gear ratios weren't standard. They were based on the principles of modular arithmetic, a system of cyclical math. The watch was a cipher machine. It was designed to take one set of numbers, the primes from the star chart, and use its gear cycles to perform a complex series of transformations, outputting a new, even more complex sequence. It was brilliant. It was beautiful. But it was the music that was the final, most elegant piece of the puzzle. Julian was right about one thing. The answer was in the music. He was just listening for the wrong thing. I transcribed the score into a music notation program and analyzed it not as a melody but as a set of data points. The notes, the rests, the time signatures, they weren't random or dissonant for emotional effect. They were instructions. The intervals between certain notes corresponded to specific mathematical operations: addition, multiplication, exponentiation. The key signatures indicated which of the transformed numbers from the watch to use. Alister hadn't written music. He had written an algorithm, encoded in the language his descendants would be most likely to misunderstand. He had used their greatest passion as the perfect camouflage for his logic. The final piece was a set of instructions on how to assemble the pieces into one impossibly long alphanumeric string. It took me 3 solid weeks of work. I barely ate. I hardly slept. My world shrank to the confines of my room, to the conversation I was having with my long-dead great-grandfather. The house grew quieter as the family's hope dwindled. The auction house came and took most of the furniture, leaving the grand rooms echoey and barren. They were defeated. They had started packing boxes, resigning themselves to a future of rented flats and diminished lives. And then, one rainy Thursday night, with the eviction notice sitting on the mantelpiece like a death certificate, I had it, the final key. A string of 128 characters, a symphony of numbers and letters born from stars, gears, and notes. I looked at it on my laptop screen, and a profound sense of calm washed over me. It was done. I walked downstairs. The living room was dark, except for a single lamp casting long shadows across the bare floorboards. Boxes were stacked against the walls like barricades. My father, mother, Aunt Genevieve, and Julian were sitting on a collection of packing crates, a silent, miserable tableau of defeat. They looked up as I entered, their faces etched with exhaustion. "What is it, Lydia?" my mother asked, her voice flat. I didn't say anything at first. I just walked over to the small table where my laptop sat, opened it, and turned it so they could all see the screen. I had the annuity's secure web portal open. The cursor blinked patiently in the password field. "I have the key," I said, my voice steady and clear in the quiet room. A wave of disbelief washed over them. Julian was the first to speak, a bitter, sarcastic edge to his voice. "Oh, you have the key? Did the numbers whisper it to you in a dream?" My father just shook his head slowly. "Lydia, please, we're not in the mood for games. We've tried everything." "You haven't tried mathematics," I replied calmly. I pulled up my files, the images of the star chart, the schematics of the watch, the musical notation. For the next 20 minutes I walked them through it. I didn't just give them the answer, I showed them the proof. I explained the prime numbers hidden in the star catalog. I demonstrated the modular arithmetic of the watch's gears. I showed them how the musical intervals were not a melody but a set of commands, an instruction set for the final assembly of the code. "The music wasn't meant to be played, Julian," I said, looking directly at him. "It was meant to be read. It was an algorithm." As I spoke, their expressions began to change. The skepticism slowly melted away, replaced by a dawning, stunned comprehension. Julian stared at the musical score on my screen, his face pale. He was seeing it for the first time, not as art, but as a language he had never learned to speak. My father looked from the star chart to my equations, a flicker of something awe, perhaps, or profound regret in his eyes. They had been trying to decipher a poem, and I was showing them it had been a blueprint all along. They were silent, their previous passionate theories now looking like what they were, childish fantasies. The full weight of their condescension, their decades of dismissal, seemed to hang in the air between us. They had called my world cold, dry, and lifeless, and that very world was now their only hope. My internal monologue was a quiet storm. This is it. This is the moment. All those years, all those dismissive pats on the head, all those "that's nice" dears. Look at me now. Look at what my doodling has done. When I finished my explanation, the silence was deafening. No one had anything to say. There were no more theories, no more arguments. There was only the blinking cursor on the screen. My hands were perfectly steady as I began to type. I entered the long 128-character string, each keystroke echoing slightly in the empty room. It was a complex and beautiful sequence, a testament to Alistair's genius. I finished, took a breath, and my finger hovered over the enter key. I looked at their faces, one by one. They were holding their breath, their eyes wide, fixed on the screen. This was it, the moment of truth. I clicked the mouse. For a heart-stopping second, nothing happened. The page just sat there, loading. A flicker of doubt crossed my father's face. Julian let out a small, nervous scoff, and then the screen refreshed. New words appeared in a clean, sans-serif font, stark and undeniable against the white background. Access granted. Welcome, heir of Alistair Finch. Below it, a series of account summaries began to populate. The numbers filled the screen, growing longer and longer, a cascade of zeros that seemed to stretch into infinity. It was an astronomical sum, a figure so large it seemed unreal. It wasn't just salvation, it was a dynasty. The silence in the room stretched, taut and fragile until it finally snapped. It wasn't with a cheer or a cry of joy. It was with a small, choked sound from my father. He just stared at the screen, his mouth slightly agape, his face a complex mask of relief, disbelief, and a profound, world-altering shock. Julian looked as though he'd been hollowed out. His entire worldview, his belief in the supremacy of his art, had just been rendered utterly and completely irrelevant by a string of characters he couldn't even begin to comprehend. My mother and Aunt Genevieve just stared, their eyes wide and unblinking. They weren't looking at the money, they were looking at me. For the first time in my entire life, they were truly, properly seeing me. The first word spoken in our new reality came from my father. He tore his eyes away from the screen and looked at me, his voice a hoarse whisper. How? It wasn't a question of doubt anymore. It was a plea for understanding. He was asking how I had seen a universe where he had only seen a blank wall, so I explained it again, more slowly this time, pulling up the relevant documents, showing him the chain of logic, the irrefutable steps that led from the clues to the solution. This time they didn't interrupt. They listened. They leaned forward, hanging on every word about prime numbers and modular arithmetic, their faces rapt with the kind of attention they usually reserved for an art curator's lecture. The power in the room had not just shifted, it had undergone a tectonic reversal. I was no longer the odd, quiet moon orbiting their brilliant sun. I was the gravitational center. Everything, now, revolved around me. Aunt Genevieve was the first to adapt to the new political climate. She broke the spell of stunned silence with a high, slightly hysterical laugh. "Oh, Lydia, I always knew you had a special mind, so wonderfully focused. Your great-grandfather would have been so proud. It's the Finch intellect, you see, Robert," she said, turning to my father. "It just expresses itself in different ways." This sudden, syrupy praise was so transparent, so nakedly opportunistic, that it was almost comical. She was already rewriting history, painting me as a hidden genius she had championed all along. My mother quickly followed suit, her hand fluttering to her heart. "We just didn't understand, darling. It's all so complex. We're so proud of you." Their words were like rain on a waterproof coat. They slid right off me. Their pride wasn't for me, not really. It was for the number on the screen. They weren't proud of my mind. They were relieved by its result. I just nodded, offering a small, non-committal smile. Inside, I felt a strange and powerful calm. Their validation, which I had craved for so long, had finally arrived, and I was surprised to find that it meant absolutely nothing to me. The following day, the real test began. The initial shock had worn off, replaced by a giddy, frantic energy. My father, mother, and aunt cornered me in the kitchen, their faces flushed with excitement. They had a notepad full of plans. "First thing," my father said, his old, booming confidence returning, "is we call the auction house and cancel everything. Then we call the bank and buy back the house. We can get a better price now that they think we're desperate, and we must reinvest in Julian's career." Genevieve chimed in, her voice earnest. "This is the perfect opportunity. He can rent a proper concert hall, hire a publicist. With this kind of backing, there's no limit to what he can achieve." They were already spending the money, already falling back into their old patterns, assuming the old power structure was still in place just with a newly replenished treasury. They assumed I was just the key, and now that the door was open, they could take it from here. I let them finish, listening patiently to their grand, self-serving plans. When they were done, I took a slow sip of my coffee and looked at them. "No," I said. The single word dropped into the room with the force of a physical object. They stared at me, confused. "No," my father repeated, as if he'd misheard. "We're not buying back the house," I stated, my voice even and calm. "It's a monument to a lifestyle we can no longer afford, emotionally or financially, and we are not investing a single penny more in vanity projects. The days of funding failure because it's artistic are over." I stood up and faced them, feeling a strength I never knew I possessed. Alistair Finch locked that fortune away to protect it from the very kind of thinking that just destroyed us. He didn't want it spent on whims, he wanted it protected by logic and reason. Since I was the one who understood his logic, I will be the one to honor his intent. I will be managing this fortune, with the help of Mr. Davies. I will set up trusts to ensure that everyone is housed, that everyone is stable and secure. You will never have to worry about money again, but the control, the decision-making, rests with me. The shock on their faces was profound. It was deeper than the shock of finding out they were ruined, deeper even than the shock of seeing the fortune restored. This was the shock of a fundamental law of their universe being overturned. I, Lydia, a quiet mathematical oddity, was dictating terms. My father started to bluster, his face turning a deep red. "Now see here, Lydia, I am still your father, and you are the man who lost everything." I interrupted, my voice still quiet but now edged with steel. "Your management privileges have been revoked. This is not up for negotiation." There was nothing they could say. I held all the cards. I had the key, both literally and figuratively. They had spent a lifetime treating me like a child, and in one fell swoop I had become the matriarch of the family. It wasn't an act of revenge. It was an act of simple mathematical necessity. It was the only logical solution to the problem. A year passed. Life settled into a new, previously unimaginable equilibrium. I didn't buy back the old house. Instead, I established my own financial consultancy firm, specializing in exactly the kind of complex asset management and cryptographic security that had saved us. My firm became wildly successful, my reputation built on the quiet, unshakable foundation of competence. I bought a home for myself, a modern minimalist house with clean lines and lots of glass, a place where light was welcomed, not shunned. It was a space that reflected my own mind, ordered, calm, and uncluttered by the past. For my family, I purchased a respectable but far more modest home in a quiet suburb. They were comfortable, secure, and completely stripped of their former grandeur. The grand piano was replaced by a small upright. The oil paintings were replaced with tastefully framed prints. They were financially stable but no longer opulent. Their ability to use money as a substitute for personality had been taken away. The change in their demeanor was fascinating to observe. They treated me with a new, cautious respect that bordered on fear. Family dinners, which I still attended out of a lingering sense of duty, were tense, formal affairs. They would ask for my opinion on the global economy. They would listen, really listen, when I spoke. They would try to use words like algorithm and data in conversation, hoping to impress me. It was a pathetic, clumsy attempt to speak my language after years of demanding I speak theirs. My Aunt Genevieve was the most transparent. She would constantly try to flatter me, praising my brilliant business acumen before trying to subtly steer the conversation towards a new opportunity for Julian. I would just smile and change the subject, and she would deflate, her flattery having found no purchase. Julian, to his credit, handled the humiliation better than the others. The shattering of his lifelong belief in his own genius had forced him into a period of deep introspection. With the endless fountain of family money cut off, he could no longer afford to be a full-time, visionary artist. He took a job teaching cello to children at a local music school. The work humbled him. It forced him to engage with music not as a platform for his own ego, but as a craft, a skill to be passed on. It forced him to be practical. One Saturday afternoon, he came to visit me at my new house. It was the first time he had come alone. We sat on my minimalist patio, overlooking a garden I had designed based on fractal geometry. The silence between us was awkward, filled with the ghosts of 1,000 slights and a lifetime of misunderstanding. Finally, he spoke. "I wanted to apologize, Lydia," he said, not looking at me but out at the garden, "for everything, for all of it. I never understood your world. I never even tried. I just thought it was less than mine." He shook his head, a small, sad smile on his face. "We were all such arrogant fools. We thought we were appreciating beauty, but we were just worshipping ourselves." He reached into his bag and pulled out a single sheet of music. He handed it to me. I wrote this. It's not very good, but I was thinking about what you said, about how Alistair's music was based on math. So I tried to do something similar. I based the chord progressions on the Fibonacci sequence. I looked at the sheet music. The melody was simple, but there was an underlying structure to it, an elegant logic that had never been present in his work before. It was a peace offering. It was an admission that my world had value, that it had its own kind of beauty. "Thank you, Julian," I said, and for the first time I felt a genuine warmth towards him. "I'd love to hear you play it sometime." It wasn't a grand reconciliation. The deep fractures in our family could never be fully healed, but it was a start. It was a single harmonious chord in a lifetime of dissonance. Looking back now, I realize the greatest gift my family ever gave me was their dismissal. Their inability to see my worth forced me to build it for myself, on my own terms, in a place they could never reach. I spent years thinking I needed their applause, their approval, their validation. But when I finally got it, I discovered it was a hollow prize. The real victory wasn't the moment I unlocked the fortune. It was the moment I realized I didn't need their permission to be brilliant. My love for mathematics wasn't a strange quirk or a social deficiency, it was my inheritance. It was the key, not just to Alistair's annuity, but to my own life. I finally understood the man who had seen the future so clearly. He knew that art, for all its beauty, is subjective, but a proof is a proof. The numbers don't lie. They don't play favorites. They simply are. And in that beautiful, irrefutable certainty, I had finally found my home. The journey was long, and believe me, incredibly painful at times. But it taught me that your value is not a reflection in someone else's eyes. It's a solid, unshakable thing that you build inside yourself, one logical step at a time. Sometimes the people who underestimate you the most are the ones who are inadvertently giving you the most powerful motivation to succeed. They draw a small box for you, and in learning to break out of it, you discover you're capable of building a world they can't even imagine. I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Have you ever had a skill or a passion that others dismissed, only to find it become your greatest strength? Share your story below. I read as many as I can. Don't forget to like this video if my story resonated with you, and please subscribe for more stories about finding strength in unexpected places. Thank you so much for joining me today, and for listening to my journey. Remember that family isn't always about blood. It's about who sees you, who values you, and who has the grace to admit when they were wrong. I wish you all the strength to solve your own puzzles,